In the rotting silence of a Louisiana bayou, a single ledger clawed its way out of the mud in the fire. Inside, names. Hundreds of them. Names that had already been written in the book of death years earlier. Yet there they were, alive, breathing, working the cotton rows under the same merciless sun. Gideon Harwell knew why. And God, it seems, was watching. The air in Tensaw Parish never quite forgets. It carries the weight of every sin ever committed on that flat, black soil, every lash, every sail, every unmarked grave. Even now, long after the war that tore the chains from men's wrists, the land itself seems to breathe with guilt. Cypress knees rise from the water like accusing fingers. Spanish moss drips like funeral veils. And somewhere beneath the slow-moving bayou channels, secrets refuse to stay buried. It was never supposed to survive. Nothing about the Harwell plantation was meant to outlast the system that built it. Plantations like this one were designed to erase their own tracks, ledgers burned, graves flattened, names deliberately forgotten. Atrocity prefers amnesia. But divine justice, it turns out, has a longer memory than any man. Sometime in the summer of 1873, on the crumbling remains of what had once been the Harwell estate, a storage shed finally surrendered to time. One of its ancient support beams snapped with a sound like a breaking bone. The roof folded inward, slow and deliberate, as if the building itself had chosen the moment. When the dust settled and the workers began pulling away splintered timbers, they found a small tin box wedged at an impossible angle, protected, almost deliberately, by the way the debris had fallen. Inside that box lay three ordinary things, and one that was not ordinary at all. A worn leather wallet, empty. A bundle of letters tied with frayed cord. And the ledger. It was nothing to look at. Cloth-bound, warped by decades of Louisiana damp, pages the color of dried blood at the edges. The kind of book any planter might have kept without a second thought. But when the new owner's wife, Clara Oakes, opened it on a rainy October afternoon, something shifted inside her that would never shift back. She sat alone in the parlor while the bayou rain drummed against the windows like impatient spirits. The house smelled of mildew and old wax. Her fingers traced the careful copperplate handwriting of Gideon Harwell, a man dead for years yet still reaching through time. At first it was ordinary plantation accounting, names, ages, tasks, purchases, deaths. The cold arithmetic of human property. Then she reached the middle pages. And the dead began to speak. There, listed in the same meticulous hand, were people whose deaths had already been recorded earlier in the very same book. Not similar names. The exact same names. The exact same physical descriptions. The exact same origins. A man known only as tall, left cheek scar. Dead in 1848. Reappearing in 1853, alive, assigned to the gin house. A woman noted as speaks French, gentle with children. Dead in 1847. Reappearing in 1855, alive, working the big house again. A boy, simply entered as Boy 7, purchased Natchez, March 1844. Dead in 1846. Reappearing in 1852, alive, carrying water to the fields. Clara's breath caught. The rain outside seemed to stop, as though even the weather was listening. She closed the book, opened it again, and the names were still there, defiant, impossible, blasphemous. These were not clerical errors. These were not mistakes. These were resurrections written in ink. That night she told her husband, Bernard Oakes, a practical northern man who believed in ledgers the way other men believe in God. He offered the rational explanation every reasonable person would reach for: duplication, fatigue, poor record-keeping by a single exhausted planter over decades. But Clara could not shake the feeling that something far older and far darker was at work. Because there was one more thing. Tucked between two pages near the back, written in a different hand, cramped, hurried, as though the writer had been trembling or hiding, were 5 words that would haunt her for the rest of her life. They are not the same ones. 5 words. No signature. No explanation. Just a warning slipped into the book like a dagger between ribs. They are not the same ones. Not the same as the ones who died? Then who were they? And why would Gideon Harwell, quiet, watchful, meticulous Gideon, record the dead as living without a flicker of concern? Clara did not sleep that night. She lay awake listening to the bayou, imagining she could hear the soft shuffle of bare feet on wet earth, feet that had once been carried away in chains, feet that should have been dust, yet somehow walked again. She wrote to her brother in Boston, Thomas Garrett, a historian who had spent his life studying the paper trails of the American sin. She did not mention the hidden note. Not yet. She only asked about duplicate names in plantation records. His reply came 3 weeks later. He had seen name falsification before, for tax evasion, for hiding illegal sales, for inflating inventories. But never this. Never the same scars, the same skills, the same purchase dates attached to both the dead and the living. He asked to see the ledger. Thomas Garrett arrived in Tensas Parish in the spring of 1874 like a man walking into a cathedral of ghosts. Lean, precise, spectacles forever sliding down his nose, notebook in hand. He believed the past could be known if one was only rigorous enough. He had no idea that some pasts do not want to be known. For 6 weeks he read, cross-referenced, interviewed. He spoke with former neighbors, with the few white men who had done business with Gideon Harwell, and through a careful intermediary named Robert Dufour, with the black community that still carried the real history and whispered stories passed down like forbidden scripture. Robert Dufour was no ordinary go-between. Freeborn Creole, barber, teacher, Reconstruction organizer, he had learned early that truth is a dangerous currency in Louisiana. He agreed to help Thomas only on one condition: whatever they found would be written down correctly, permanently, by a man with the power to make white America listen. What Robert carried was not one story. It was layers, concentric rings of pain, each deeper and older than the last. The outermost ring was the ledger itself. The next ring was the sales. Around 1848 to 1849, just as the first dead names began reappearing in the ledger, several enslaved people on the Harwell place were sold. Not to the next parish over. Not in the usual local shuffling of labor. These people were sold south and west, down the river to New Orleans, into the deep, hungry markets that fed the sugar plantations and the cotton frontiers beyond. Sold so completely that no letter, no rumor, no trace ever returned. That alone was common enough to be ordinary in the Cotton Kingdom. Families torn apart like cloth ripped down the middle. Mothers watching children disappear downriver forever. Fathers knowing their wives would never see them again. But what made these sales different, what gave the stories their particular, shivering texture, was the way they had been hidden. Not merely concealed from outsiders. Concealed from the people on the plantation itself. The families of those sold were told their loved ones had died. Buried on the place. Fever, perhaps. Or accident in the swamp. Small wooden crosses were planted. Mourning was permitted, briefly. Then life continued under the same sun. Yet the ledger, the private, secret ledger Gideon Harwell kept for his eyes alone, told a different truth. The sold were listed as dead. Then, years later, the exact same names, exact same scars, exact same voices, reappeared. Alive. Working. Breathing. As though death itself had been bought and sold like another bale of cotton. Thomas Garrett sat in the parlor that first evening, ledger open before him, and felt the room grow colder though the fire burned steady. He looked up at Clara and said the words that would change everything. This is not a mistake. This is a man trying to erase souls from the book of life, and then writing them back in when it suited him. He did not yet know the full horror waiting deeper in the rings of that story. He did not yet understand that the ledger was not merely an accounting of bodies. It was an accounting of sins that had begun to walk again. And somewhere in the bayou night, the wind moved through the moss like a sigh of something ancient and patient, something that had waited 40 years for the right eyes to finally read what Gideon Harwell had tried to hide from both man and God. The names that should not exist were only the beginning. The bayou at dusk breathes differently when you know what it has swallowed. The water moves slow, almost reluctant, as though carrying too much memory to hurry. Fireflies rise like small, hesitant prayers against the gathering dark. And in the quarters long gone now, but still felt in the soil, people once spoke in lowered voices about a balance no white man should have been allowed to keep. Daratha was one of the last who remembered clearly. Born on Harwell land when the century was still young, she lived to see emancipation, reconstruction, and the slow return of old shadows. In her late 60s, eyes clouded but memory sharp as river glass, she sat with Robert Dufour under the live oaks and spoke in Creole French that carried the cadence of psalms and warnings. "They told us fever took them," she said. "All four. In the same week of July. One morning working the rows, the next morning dawn. No coughing. No burning skin. No night cries. Just, gone." Robert asked the question gently. "You believed it?" Daratha's look was patient, the patience of someone who has outlived disbelief. "I was 12. My mother taught me, fever leaves signs. You see the sweat, hear the delirium, smell the sickness in the cabin. These four? They ate supper. They slept. Dawn came. They were not there." She paused, fingers tracing an invisible cross on her apron. "Gideon came to the quarters himself. Said the Lord took them quick. Said we should pray. We prayed. But the graves were empty. No one dug. No one carried bodies. Just words. If the sales had been ordinary, legal, documented, part of the daily commerce of human flesh, there would have been no need for the fiction. Louisiana law placed no meaningful limit on a master's right to sell, separate, or destroy. A planter could thin his workforce, send children downriver, break families like kindling, and the state would call it property management. So why lie? Thomas Garrett circled the word in his notebook again and again: irregular. The pieces arrived slowly, like stones turned over in dark water. Each one small. Each one cold. A private account in Vidalia, across the Mississippi in Concordia Parish. Separate from the plantation's main books. A former bank clerk, Augustus, now frail in a Natchez boarding house, remembered Gideon Harwell arriving once every few months, always alone, always carrying a leather case. Never lingered. Never chatted. Deposited cash or banknotes, withdrew nothing. The account existed for one purpose: to receive money no one else was meant to trace. Then there was the man they called the counter. He appeared in the 1850s, always with Gideon. Tall, thin, dressed like a city undertaker. Carried a small tally board, wooden, notched, precise. Walked the fields at dusk. Walked the quarters at dawn. Counted heads. Made marks. Never spoke to the enslaved. Never looked them in the eye. Gideon walked beside him like a man escorting something dangerous. No one knew his name. Faces blur after decades. But the habit remained: he counted. He marked. He left. And then the replacements. George, 70 now, hands still calloused from decades in the fields, spoke one evening on the Oaks Gallery as the bayou turned ink black. Lantern light flickered across his face like guilt. After they were taken, not died, taken, others came. Not right away. Weeks. Sometimes months. New faces. New voices. But Gideon gave them the same tasks. Same cabins. After a while, he called them by the old names. Thomas felt the air thicken. George continued. At first we thought he was confused. Or cruel in some new way. My mother said no. She said he was keeping something in balance. The book had to stay the same. The numbers had to match. He needed the dead to stay dead on paper, but the living had to fill their places exactly. Thomas stared at the word irregular until the ink seemed to bleed. What emerged over months, pieced together from guarded conversations, half-remembered glances, fragments Robert coaxed from people who had every reason to stay silent, was not mere tax evasion or hidden profit. It was a substitution scheme so precise, so profane, it required the ledger's falsifications as its very bones. Around 1848 or 1849, Gideon Harwell entered a quiet arrangement with a network of traders who moved between the Upper South and the Gulf Coast's insatiable markets. Not simple sales. Not open auctions. A profile would arrive requested by sugar planters in Louisiana's bayous or cotton kings pushing into Texas. Tall man, strong back, no family ties. Young woman, speaks French, good with infants. Boy, quick hands, already broken to labor. Harwell would scan his own quarters. Identify matches. Arrange the sale through back channels. Record the person as dead, fever, accident, runaway, caught and drowned. Small grave markers went up. Mourning was brief. Life moved on. Then the replacements arrived. Quietly purchased. Often people already torn from other plantations through similar deals. Their own names, histories, families stripped away. Installed in the same roles. Given the same tasks. And then, slowly, deliberately, given the same names. The ledger never showed loss. No net change in taxable property. No red flags for assessors. No questions from neighbors. The cotton bales kept coming. The balances stayed perfect. The money flowed into Vidalia. Regular. Predictable. Like tribute. Thomas could not determine the full scale. 6 years minimum. Perhaps longer. Dozens of souls, perhaps more. Each one erased once when sold. Erased again when replaced. Their true names buried twice. And the hidden note, they are not the same once, became something else entirely. Not an outsider's discovery. Not a clerk's correction. A testimony. Written by someone inside the quarters. Someone close enough to the ledger to slip paper between its pages. Someone who had learned letters late, painfully, rarely. The handwriting careful but unpracticed. A hand that gripped the pen like a weapon. Someone who knew the replacements were wearing stolen lives. Someone who saw the new faces answer to dead names and felt the violation in their bones. 5 words. The smallest possible protest against the largest possible theft. Not an accusation shouted in daylight. A whisper sealed inside the book itself, placed where it might outlast fire, flood, time. Thomas sat alone one night with the ledger open. Lantern low. Bayou frogs chanting like witnesses. He stared at those 5 words until his eyes burned. He was not a man given to visions. Yet in that moment he felt it, the weight of divine justice deferred. Not the quick lightning of wrath. The slow, patient turning of a wheel older than the plantation, older than the river. Gideon Harwell had tried to balance the books of man. Someone, perhaps many, had reminded the ledger that God keeps a different set of accounts. And God, Scripture says, is not mocked. Thomas wrote to Clara Oakes that fall. I find myself returning to those 5 words more than reason allows. They are quiet. They are final. They are true. The trail led next to Vidalia. To a name, Clement Yates. And to the man who facilitated everything. Aldous Crane. The search for Aldous Crane felt like following a ghost through fog. Thomas Garrett moved methodically Natchez to New Orleans to Baton Rouge, finally to the pine-shadowed edges of East Texas. Garland's Crossing was barely a place, a scattering of clapboard houses, a dirt road that turned to red mud after rain, a general store that sold everything and forgave nothing. Crane had come here in 1865, a man already hollowed out, carrying money he no longer seemed to want and memories he no longer seemed able to carry alone. He died in April 1871. Widower. No children. No mourners beyond a housekeeper named Mercy and a neighbor named Walter who checked on him when the fever finally won. Walter still lived in 1875 when Thomas arrived, gray-haired, loose-tongued, relieved someone had finally come asking. Crane wasn't right, Walter told him on the porch one evening, cicadas screaming in the heat. He sat out here most days, staring at nothing. Burned letters from Louisiana the minute they came. Drank steady, not to get drunk, just to keep steady. Polite enough, but you could tell he was carrying something that weighed more than a man ought to carry alone. Near the end, Crane had spoken. Not to Walter. To a circuit-riding Methodist preacher named Ephraim who passed through twice a year like judgment on horseback. Ephraim was severe, spare, voice trained for open fields and revival tents. When Thomas found him at a camp meeting in Henderson County that fall, Ephraim folded his arms and said the expected words, pastoral confidence. Nothing shared that was told in confidence. Thomas did not argue or threaten. He spoke plainly, like a man laying stones in a foundation. The people harmed by what Crane did have no other record. No graves with their names. No children who know their mothers' faces. What I seek isn't confession, it's fact. And facts belong to history, not to silence. Ephraim listened. Long silence under the Texas stars. Then he kept a ledger of his own. Thomas went still, breath caught like a hook. Every transaction he facilitated. Every name. Every place they came from, every place they went. He said the worst sin wasn't the moving, it was the forgetting. The whole system depended on people disappearing so completely they forgot themselves. He kept the ledger to contest that. As long as the names lived somewhere, the forgetting wasn't total. Where is it? Thomas asked. Ephraim shook his head. He never showed me. Said it was his. Said he hadn't decided what to do with it. Crane's house was cleared by the county after his death. Modest estate sold to a Georgia relative who never set foot in Texas. Papers, books, boxes scattered to debts, public auction, county storage. Thomas returned to Garland's Crossing. 3 weeks of knocking on doors, searching attics, asking Mercy, who now lived with her daughter and remembered clearly. There was a book, she said. In a strong box under his bed. He took it out sometimes at night. Read it like scripture. Handled it gentle, like it might break. Or like it might burn him. The strong box was gone. County administrator had taken boxes for debts. Some sold. Some stored. The county clerk was young, barely bearded, uninterested but obliging. He let Thomas into the storage room, low ceiling, dust thick as felt, smell of mildew and old grief. 2 days of turning boxes, coughing through yellowed papers. On the second afternoon, lowest shelf, back corner, a small leather-bound ledger. Metal clasp rusted shut but intact. Leather blackened by time and perhaps by conscience. Inside front cover, in a hand clear and deliberate. Aldous Crane. His account of accounts. God forgive me. Thomas read it in that dim room over 3 days. Barely slept. The county clerk hovered sometimes, sensing importance but asking nothing. Crane's ledger was clinical at first glance, transactions, dates, amounts, names. Hundreds of names. 1843 to 1863. 20 years of facilitated movements. But Crane had done what Harwell never could or never dared. Beside many names brief, almost reluctant, he wrote observations. Not for buyers. Not for profit. For himself. A man from Virginia, sold Richmond, then Charleston, then to Louisiana. A woman from Kentucky, 2 children unseen 7 years. A boy of 12, spoke 3 languages, first master French Creole from Saint-Domingue refugee. Small notes. Human fragments. Accumulating across decades into something that hovered between record and confession. The system erased. Crane annotated. As though, dying alone in Texas, he had decided the only honest thing left was truth in the margins. The Harwell entries appeared on pages 34 and 35. 1848 to 1858. 19 names. 19 people funneled through the network. Opposite each, destination, not plantation names, but codes. Letters and numbers. Impenetrable at first. 8 of those 19 matched Harwell's deceased. Sold south. Recorded dead. Replaced. Books balanced. Souls erased. Beside one name, Crane wrote. Spoke English and French. Kept records for the house. Understood what she read. Thomas stared until the lantern flame swam. A woman. Literate. Trusted near the ledger. close enough to slip 5 words between pages. They are not the same ones. Her name in Crane's ledger, Adah. Taken 1849. Destination, coded. It took 8 months to break the code. Thomas sent copies to his brother-in-law, ex-signal officer, wartime ciphers, and a mathematics professor in Ohio. Worked evenings himself, hypotheses, dead ends, restarts. Simple transposition cipher. Keyword, name of a Mississippi town. Destinations resolved: New Orleans clearing houses, Mississippi River towns, Texas frontiers, some Gulf routes reaching Caribbean shadows. The system was deliberate. Multiple transactions. Layered sails. Origins obscured. Trails. Cold. Clean breaks. People made unrecognizable to their own kin. Adah's destination, a New Orleans commission house on the edge of the commercial district. Gateway to the deeper trade. By 1875 the house was gone. Building now dry goods. Records vanished with the war. Thomas went anyway. Winter 1876. New Orleans, reconstruction dying slow. Streets tense. Air thick with jasmine and suspicion. He moved quiet. Inconspicuous. Asked careful questions. No trace of Adah living. Expected none. But in the back room of a church serving free black people since the 1830s, independent registers, distrustful of city books, he found it. Baptism entry. Adah. Approximate, 30 years. Enslaved. Origin, Louisiana, Tensaw Parish. Priest's note, she asked that we keep her name. She said, if I am ever searched for, let there be a record that says I was here. Thomas read it 3 times. Closed the register. Thanked the deacon. Walked into December cold. Stood on the banquette. Watched carriages pass. Thought of a woman who chained, sold, erased, had used the only weapons left, literacy. Foresight. A note in the ledger. A name in a church book. 2 acts of resistance. 2 refusals to disappear. Whether she lived long, died young, suffered or found small mercies, unknown. The system intended silence. She left echoes. Thomas returned to Tensaw Parish spring 1876. Nearly 2 years gone. Found Robert Dufour changed. Thinner. Eyes watchful. Reconstruction crumbling. Schools threatened. Organizers marked. Protection fading. They met at the Oaks house, May evening warm with lightning bugs. Thomas laid it all out, the full shape. Crane's ledger. Adah's note. Adah's baptism. The woman who kept records. Who understood what she read. Who testified before she was taken. And the question neither could answer yet. What had Gideon Harwell done when he discovered the note? The parlor at the Oaks house smelled of lamp oil and late spring honeysuckle that evening in 1876. Lightning bugs drifted past the open windows like slow embers. Thomas Garrett sat across from Robert Dufour, the ledger between them like an open wound. Eugenia Dufour sat in the corner rocking chair, hands folded, eyes steady. She had listened to the entire account without a word: Crane's dying ledger, Adah's baptism, the 19 names that had been erased and replaced like entries in a merchant's daybook. When Thomas finished, the room held its breath. Robert broke the silence first. What are you going to do with it all? Thomas had turned the question over for months like a stone smoothed by the river. Write it down. Publish it. Not for court, there is no court left that would hear this. The men who could answer are dust. But to make the record exist. To make forgetting harder. Eugenia spoke from the shadows. And who reads it? Thomas met her gaze. Scholars. Historians. Librarians who collect such things. She did not blink. Those 19 people. Their children. Grandchildren. Some still live in this parish. Some in the next. If your book names them, where they came from, what was taken, where they went, someone might find a thread. A grandmother. An uncle sold south. A name they heard once in a lullaby. Thomas felt the shift inside him. Not defeat. Recognition. Eugenia continued, voice low but unyielding. The record matters. But the people it belongs to matter more. Don't let the paper become the end. That night changed the shape of the work. Thomas had arrived in Louisiana as a historian hunting documents. He left understanding that documents are never separate from the living who inherit their scars. Over the next year, while he drafted what would become his privately printed monograph, he and Robert pursued the second purpose Eugenia had named, tracing the living threads back to the 19. It was harder than reading faded ink. More painful than decoding ciphers. The scheme had not only sold people, it had sold memory itself. Families built lives around absences. Stories filled the gaps. Fever took her. Drowned in the river. Runaway caught and hanged. Comforting lies told to children so they could sleep. When Thomas and Robert brought fragments of truth, names, dates, destinations, reactions varied like weather over the bayou. Some wept. Some grew angry, not at Harwell, but at the reopening of wounds long scabbed. Some refused to hear it at all. Let the dead stay dead, one woman told Robert. Knowing changes nothing but the hurt. Yet 3 families did connect. A grandmother in waterproof whose mother had vanished in 1852, same description Crane noted, strong back, quiet, good with needle. A man in Faraday whose grandfather carried a scar on the left cheek and spoke of a brother sold down the river before he was born. A woman in Natchez whose family Bible listed an aunt taken by fever July 1849, the same month Crane recorded a transfer through the network. Not full reunions. Not justice. But names attached to grief. Faces imagined behind absences. This was what Adah had fought for with 5 words and a baptismal request. Not reversal. Continuity. Proof that the erasure was never complete. The Harwell place itself unraveled. The big house caught fire in 1877, origin disputed. Bernard Oakes's kin called it accident. Others in the parish never said the word arson, but the way they looked at the charred timbers spoke plainly enough. The land was carved into parcels. Sold. Resold. By 1890 nothing of the original complex remained, no gallery, no gin house, no storage shed where the tin box had waited 40 years to be found. Cotton still grew there, tended by black families who knew the soil's history only in fragments passed like heirlooms. Clara Oakes lived until 1909. She kept Thomas's monograph on a shelf beside her Bible. Beside it, in a plain envelope, her own careful copy of the hidden note. They are not the same ones. She left both to her daughter with instructions: keep them. Read them. Remember where they came from. Whether that envelope still exists, passed down through attics, estates, moves, is beyond the archive's reach. Thomas published in Boston, spring 1879. Names in Accounting, a study in the falsification of plantation records in Tensaw Parish, Louisiana, 1848 to 1863. 83 copies. Sent to 27 colleagues, libraries, historical societies. 11 replies. Polite. Professional. Cautious. No reviews. No newspaper notices. Reconstruction had ended. The nation had chosen a different story. Thomas was not surprised. He had learned, in 4 years of chasing ink, that some truths arrive in a time when the country has already decided not to hear them. Gideon Harwell died in 1869 near Vicksburg. Pneumonia. 56. Alone in a rented room. The system that enriched him had collapsed. He outlived it just long enough to taste the poverty it left behind for men like him. Whether he ever knew the ledger survived, whether he ever suspected the note inside it, whether Adah's face returned to him in the long nights, no record tells. Adah's last trace, that 1851 baptism in New Orleans. After that, silence. Not disappearance. Only the absence of surviving paper. Thomas taught at Boston College until 1901. Wrote on archival gaps. The monograph found its way into 2 university libraries and 1 state historical society. Occasionally cited. Rarely read. Robert Dufour was shot walking home from a school meeting in 1878. Age 52. The killer never named. The case never seriously pursued. Eugenia carried the school forward another 31 years. Taught when no one else would. Found money where none seemed to exist. 3 grandchildren became teachers. 1 a lawyer. She left no memoir. She left the school still standing, still teaching. The ledger itself was donated around 1920 by Oak's descendants to a New Orleans archive. Catalogued simply, Plantation Records, Tensaw. Parish, 19th century. Shelved. Forgotten among thousands. For decades it waited in boxes. Through budget cuts. Through neglect. Through a nation's preference for cleaner histories. Yet it remains. Gideon Harwell's copperplate handwriting, precise, unhurried, still legible. The false deaths still entered in their neat columns. The replacements still wearing stolen names. And near the back, slipped between pages, in handwriting careful and slightly unpracticed. They are not the same ones. Almost 150 years now. Through fires. Through floods. Through indifference. 5 words. Not shouted. Not published in headlines. Whispered into the only book that would outlast the man who wrote the lies. Adah understood what was being done. She read the ledger. She saw the dead walk again on paper. And she refused to let the lie stand unchallenged. That refusal is what endures. The ledger does not demand belief. It demands only that we look. At the columns. At the falsified deaths. At the 5 words that answer back. And having looked, to say quietly, plainly, as she did. They are not the same ones. History is not finished when the last witness dies. It is finished only when the last person willing to read the record stops reading. The ledger is still there. The note is still there. Adah is still there, in 5 words that refuse to vanish. What do you see when you imagine those pages? Do you believe the full truth has finally surfaced, or is there still something in the margins we have not yet noticed? Leave your thoughts below.